How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to my channel. I hope you are all having a wonderful Tuesday. And today was a wonderful day for chess. We had an Armageddon game, Magnus Carlsen as black, Hikaru Nakamura as white. In case you don't remember, this is Norway chess, to where the players, they start with a classical round, and if there's a decisive result, then that's the result. But if not, they move on to an Armageddon game to decide sort of the match winner. So Hikaru and Magnus drew their classical game, which means that we are set up for an Armageddon showdown where white is going to start with 10 minutes. Black will start with 7. It's not updated here because the moves weren't made yet, but black will start with 7 minutes, but they have draw odds, meaning that Magnus gets credit for the match win if he draws with black and less time. So clearly the work is kind of cut out for both of them, and so this will be sort of important context because Hikaru has to win this game, and also the players do not get increment until move 40, in which they would get a 1 second increment, which even then is little time to sort of just like play the moves over the board. That will be important later, so stay tuned. The opening is not of utmost importance to sort of deep dive into necessarily, just standard, I guess, kind of Grunfeld, Slavish opening. I mean, it starts out as a ready, but as we all know, ready can sort of like transpose into a lot of different things. I'd say the first interesting moment was a bishop trade was offered, and bishop takes g7. This move, rook a c1, is very fascinating. The casual observer might be thinking, well, what's the point behind rook a c1? You're not even putting the rook on an open file. If anything, you're putting the rook on a closed file in front of the pawn. What's the point? Well, Hikaru wants to play c4, c5 to attack the knight and kind of put pressure on this b7 pawn. So if you play c4 move earlier, then you are subjecting this pawn to be taken. So Magnus would be able to take, bishop takes, and then queen takes d4. And you just lost an important central pawn, and you're not able to play c5 because the queen is also covering it. Whereas, after rook a c1, if Magnus just plays some random move, then you have the ability to play c4. And if bishop takes, queen takes, now with the rook on c1, you can play c5. And now the knight moves, then the queen can take the pawn, and also would be able to link up with the bishop to possibly take the c6 pawn as well. So that's the idea behind rook c1, and this is where Magnus sort of went to the tank a little bit and ended up playing the move c5 himself, with the idea of sort of physically stopping the pawn from eventually getting to c5. The problem with c5 is that it just loses a pawn after d takes c5, knight d7, queen b4. Now, these are world championship caliber players, so it's not, Magnus didn't just lose a pawn and just have no compensation for it. Obviously, these are doubled isolated pawns, so they're going to be hard to sort of hold on to, compared to a situation like if this pawn were back here, then you have a much more stable pawn structure, and white would just be up a clean pawn. Whereas with the pawn on c5, Magnus will have sort of opportunities to attack it. You already have the knight on d7, queen, rook can sort of like kind of zone in on that pawn. So knight f6, some more moves were played. Bishop h3 is kind of a smart way to stop the rook from going to c8, which would have been a key sort of attacking resource to the pawn. Queen c7, b6. So Magnus is willing to trade these pawns off and sort of understand that, yes, he's down a pawn, but you have both the c pawn and the a pawns to play against. They're both isolated pawns, and you're also kind of occupying the open files. So if anything, the burden of proof is kind of on Hikaru to sort of prove his advantage. So we see the move queen b2, Magnus plays rook a4, and here Hikaru plays the brilliant bishop e6. Obviously, the idea behind bishop e6 is that if the bishop gets taken, then oops, there is a royal fork. The king and queen are being forked by the knight on the e6 square. Shockingly, Magnus did not take the bishop and played rook a5. Now, what I will oftentimes say is that you generally want to avoid just playing fancy moves just to play fancy moves, because sort of my point being that if the fancy move isn't played into or the sacrifice isn't accepted, then you could put yourself in a difficult situation. However, Hikaru did have a strategic positioning in mind when he played bishop e6, which is to kind of plant the bishop on b3 and also protect the a2 pawn. So it wasn't just like some show-off move or anything like that. So bishop e6 was played, Magnus played rook a5, Hikaru played bishop b3, e5, knight c2, h5, h4. Now, this is going to be kind of the start of just a bunch of like mistakes, missed wins, brilliancies as well for both sides. Do keep in mind this is a blitz game, and it's kind of a crazy blitz game where Hikaru has to win. So I'm not really going to be here to overanalyze every single sort of like mistake and variation that could have happened. I will say here that h4 is a mistake because the best move is knight e3, which does make sense in that context. But the reason h4 is a mistake is because it allows... You notice that the bishop is sort of doing a good job of controlling the light squares in front of the king. So when you have a situation like that, what you logically want to do is plant the queen on h3, and to where the queen from h3 could deliver multiple checkmates. So how do you do that? You would play a move like queen c8, fly the queen into h3, and then deliver checkmate. Although it's not that simple, it's not like the World Blitz champion. I mean, he's won World Blitz championships. I'm not sure. He's not defending, obviously. But it's not like one of the best players in the world is going to fall for like a elementary mate in 2 or anything like that. So after queen c8, Hikaru could play king h2. But then there's a move like knight g4, king goes back to g1. And the knight would prevent the queen from flying into h3. But after f5, simply everything's in Magnus's favor. You have 2 pieces sort of inside of the king, as well as this queen and the rook sort of like backing up the f5 pawn, the f5 pawn itself. So clearly Hikaru would be in trouble from this position. But after h4, Magnus plays knight g4, sort of missing that point. Hikaru plays knight a3, g5 is on the board, knight c4. Again, I'm not really here to overanalyze these mistakes. I'm more sort of here to kind of like broadcast what happened and bring home some instructive points. Knight c4 attacks the rook, but Magnus doesn't really care. He's just going to take the pawn, which the computer gives a brilliancy. Now, the reason the rook should not be taken is not recapturing. It's not some like lame sacrifice, because Magnus would play h takes g3 and kind of shredding open the king's position. And if f takes g3, then Magnus would have this crushing move, queen h5, and the queen and the bishop sort of tag team to just, decimate the white king, right? So the rook clearly shouldn't be taken. Hikaru just plays f3, which is a blunder, or it's given a blunder because of queen c5, king h1, and the best move for black is just to play rook a6. And the idea behind rook a6 would be that the bishop cannot be captured. Sorry, the knight cannot be captured because it's illegal, because the pawn is pinned to the king. And if the bishop is taken, then you have a situation where black plays a move like b5, forcing the knight to move, let's say knight d2, and then h takes g3, and the king is just simply wide open. There are ideas of like queen e7, queen h4 coming, for instance, checkmate, maybe knight f2 is a move. You could maybe put the pawns out as well. And just kind of notice that all of white's pieces are kind of clustered on like this side, and you have the rook could swing in as well. There are like multiple ideas, right? So, that would be pretty dangerous, clearly. So this is kind of important. If you notice the time situation, you notice that both sides have under 2 minutes. Hikaru with 1:50, Magnus with about 1:30. Now this is move 29. Now why is that important? Because remember how I said, the players do not get increment until move 40. So if you have like 3 seconds left and 10 moves to make, you are going to lose on time. It will be physically impossible to make all the required moves. So with that said, Magnus, just look at his clock, just stare at this. It barely highlights, but just look at his time. He tanks almost all of his time. He plays bishop a8, which is a bad move. Again, I am not going to judge the players for the mistakes they make. The computers are computers, and these are humans just trying to win a blitz game, essentially. The problem is that now Magnus has so he has 24 seconds to make 10 moves after this, which is going to be very, very hard to pull off. In over the board chess, And online, it might be easy just to do it with the mouse or whatever, but over the board, you have to like physically make the moves. It's like basically one move every 2 seconds or something like that, if my math is correct. And it's just going to be very hard to pull off. It's going to be very hard physically to pull off, let alone just make quality moves. So let's sort of see how this transpires. And on Hikaru's end, you kind of have this challenge to where you would want to just like play moves and then just like kind of beat him on time, but you are dealing with the best player in the world, if not arguably the best player in the world. So the burden's even on Hikaru to sort of play accurately. So let's see how this goes. Hikaru takes the rook. Magnus recaptures. Hikaru plays e4. The idea behind e4 being to sort of like blunt this bishop, because that's kind of one of Black's key strengths in this position, is that you kind of have this combination sort of, raking the diagonals. So e4 was sort of his idea to sort of blockade that. Bishop d5 also with that idea to now trade off the bishop, so you don't have to worry about the diagonal. Bishop takes d5, pawn takes d5. Magnus plays knight e3. Ideas of like g2 checker in the air, so Hikaru plays rook g1. Magnus plays h4. Hikaru plays c4. Magnus goes queen d4, offering the queen trade, and it is accepted. Okay, so Magnus has 15 seconds to make, what is that? 1, 2, 3, 4 moves. So he's actually done quite well on the clock, just making moves instantly. But if you take stock of this position, it's just a very tricky situation because you have this knight, which is really good, but it's planted by the pawn on d4. You have these 2-pass pawns near the king, and if you can get some idea of like f5, f4, then you could get, you could get some counterplay. But Hikaru also has these 2-pass pawns, so it'll be worth watching how Hikaru utilizes the passed pawns. He plays d6, which is technically a miss, but again, I'm not really here to judge. Magnus plays rook b8. The idea behind rook b8 is that he's trying to go rook b2 and either get a checkmate on the h2 square or at least get some sort of a draw. For instance, I think it's this variation, like if, I think here he'd play rook d8, not rook 8, rook d8, but there are some variations. I think we'll see them sort of like later, but essentially, Hikaru plays rook b1, which just kind of like stops the sort of linear progression of the rook. And here, Magnus played rook d8, which computer is going to say it's a mistake, but again, he's just playing off inertia. Like, there's not really much he can do. What he needs to do, the only move for him to sort of like save the draw is to play rook c8 and kind of eye this pawn. And I think maybe what Magnus could have been afraid of, just in the little time he had to think, is this move d7. And, was it d7? I think it would have been, was it d7? As I thought, no, maybe it's a different variation. Rook c8. D7 you just go rook here. And Hikaru could play this, but then Magnus has this move g2. Anyway, there's some variation I'm thinking of. Maybe it'll just come up, but rook d8 is a mistake because Hikaru can play the move c5, and now you have a situation where, okay, I think it comes to play. Yeah, you have the 2-pass pawns versus the rook, and on an open board, 2-pass pawns on the 6th rank or higher beat the rook because if it takes, you just go like c7, and then the rook wouldn't be able to catch it, right? Well, I guess it could go to c6. So yeah, it would have to be sort of white to move. Yeah, if it's white to move and you have 2 pawns on the 6, you can just go here, and if here you push. So after c5, Magnus plays king f6, Hikaru plays c6, Magnus plays rook takes d6, and only move for white, you just have to push, and Magnus plays rook c6. Now, here it's a little bit tricky because you have to sort of like support this pawn with either rook bc1 or rook gc1. Now, one move is good, the other move doesn't work. The correct move, which Hikaru found, was rook g to c1. But let's talk about why doesn't this work? Well, the reason this doesn't work is because Magnus can play this move g2 check, and after g2, he's either going to take, which allows you to take on c1 with check, and then you keep an eye on the pawn, or after king h2, you have this move knight f1 check. Knight f1 disconnects the rooks. So if you just take the pawn, then you can take on c1 and you're still eyeing the pawn. And after knight f1, if you try to take, with the idea being to kind of like keep the rooks connected, and then if takes, you could take, you know, the other guy and then support the pawn. You take on f1, under promoting to a knight with check. Because if you under promote to a queen, then you would take with check, and then you get your own queen, and it would be a draw. So you under promote to a knight with check, and then after rook takes f1, rook takes c7, you just have a losing endgame where you're outnumbered by pawns. So that is sort of the reason why you have to play this rook to c1, because now if g2 check, you have a square for the king. You can go to g1. Whereas in the other variation, if you played this, g2, you're kind of trapped, right? So that's sort of the instructive takeaway. After rook to c1, Magnus plays knight c4, and here Hikaru finds the only winning move in this position. Actually, white to play and win. This is actually pretty instructive, because if you don't do anything, then he's going to take the pawn, and he's going to have his own sort of like stuff to do, but rook b6. Rook to b6 is game over, because if rook takes, which is what happened, then Hikaru makes a queen and wins. If knight takes b6, then you can take on c6 with check, and then you win the knight, and then you can queen as well. So, yeah, very interesting stuff. I believe rook b6 on the previous move couldn't be played. Like, it looks good here, but the problem would be rook takes b6, queen. And then you have this move, rook b2. You're threatening a mate. There's not really much you can do about it. I mean, you can like check. You'll get a perpetual if you want. You won't have problems there. But if you try to play like rook c1 to sort of like just get all the pieces in, then you have this move, rook h2, king g1, rook g2, and you just draw, because the king cannot go to f1 because of the knight. So you can just repeat, and it'll be a draw. All right, so that was the end of Magnus versus Hikaru. Hikaru sort of won that Armageddon game, which puts him in the lead for the tournament. And I should have had this standings page open earlier, but if we look at the results, I think you can see it, right? Yeah, you can probably see it pretty well. So in the second round, Arjun beat Gukesh just straight up. Gukesh, by the way, not having the greatest tournament. Like, he's been struggling since he became world champion, so hopefully he can recover. Magnus and Hikaru, we just saw that. It was a draw in the Classical, which means that they squared off in the Armageddon. And then Fabiano won a nice game against Wei Yi. So Hikaru and Arjun are tied for the lead, because Arjun won one of his Classical games and then won... Who did he beat in Armageddon? I guess he beat Wei Yi in Armageddon. So Hikaru and Arjun are tied for first, and then you have Magnus with 4 points, Fabiano with 3, Wei Yi with 1, and Gukesh with 0. Wow, Gukesh lost 2 Classical games. Yeah, that is not good. Hopefully he can recover. So in round 3, we're going to see Hikaru versus Gukesh, Magnus versus Wei Yi, and Fabiano versus Arjun. So I don't know if I'll necessarily have videos out for those or not. I mean, we'll kind of see like what happens. But either way, thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the recap. Let me know if there are any ways that I can improve or anything like that. But other than that, I will see you all for the next video. Peace.